Hello there. My name's Andy Skinner, and I work at Tudor House and Garden and also at Sea City Museum, where I work as a learning officer. I think I've got the best job in the world. Get to tell stories for most of my time, except when we're in lockdown, and then I do some other things. But I thought that in this video, I would talk a little bit about one of my interests. It's a talk I've done a couple of times, and it's about Harry Potter. Because actually, Tudor House is full of all sorts of little magical things, bits of graffiti that may have been spells. We've got some objects, the types of which that were used as witch bottles, for example, and all sorts of little mysteries. So Tudor House is a fairly magical place, and the stories of Harry Potter, for me personally, are ones that I go back to time and again. Particularly at the moment, I'm listening to the audiobooks read by Stephen Fry. They're brilliant, and particularly in times of uncertainty, we like to go back to things that perhaps give us comfort, things that we enjoy. So they're great for that. But actually the stories of Harry Potter, written by J.K. Rowling, are just full of fantastic links to real life history or myths, and so I thought we'd spend a bit of time unpicking just a few of those. We won't go into all of them by any means, and if you're interested in this, there are a couple of really good books that you can get hold of that go into them and explore them in a bit more detail. But where do you start with this, with thinking about Harry Potter and the sort of the truths behind it, the real stories behind it? Well, in the third book, Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, they make this little reference to wizards in Egypt, going from way back. So I think the Egyptian wizards is a good place to start with. Actually, before we look at them, where does magic begin? Well, the truth is we don't know, really. I suspect, though, maybe that first time that somebody made fire, that must have been pretty magical. Or maybe 10,000 years ago, when somebody was able to get a chunk of metal or rock in metal and put it in a deep heat and then smelt it, so take the metal from the ore. That must have been pretty magical too. Or perhaps when somebody grinds up a plant and gives it to somebody, and maybe they have hallucinogenic properties, or perhaps they're unwell and they get better. All those things must have seemed pretty magical, I suspect. They predate the Egyptians, but if we're talking about the Egyptians, they're pretty interesting, because what we find in ancient Egypt are people looking at the world around them and creating gods and goddesses, myths around what they see. For example, one of the great animals that was venerated at the time were beetles. You've probably all heard of scarab beetles. We've got a couple in our collection here at Southampton Museums. And there was a god called Khepri, and he had the head of a beetle, and he represented the sun. You might think, why on earth is a beetle going to represent the sun? Well, in Egypt you have dung beetles, and what they do is they push balls of dirt, and they kind of create food balls that they can then bury and eat later. And of course, if you're an Egyptian person and you're watching a beetle pushing a ball, then you look up at the sky, you see the sun going across, And you think, well, it must be a giant beetle pushing the sun across the sky. So you have all the sorts of interesting little links like this. The first wizard that we know about was from about 2500 BC, 4,500 years old. He was Egyptian. He was called Didi, and he features in something called the Westcar Papyrus. And his tricks included eating 500 loaves of bread and drinking 100 gallons of beer every day. It's pretty impressive, I think you'll agree. He also apparently decapitated a goose, placed the head at one end of a hall and the rest at the other end before telling a spell, and then it made the duck waddle, get its head, and then go out of the hall. So there we are, there's our first wizard, not mentioned in the Harry Potter series. I should say I'll try not to mention anything that really happens in the Harry Potter stories, in case you haven't read them or listened to them or watched the films. If I do, I'll give you a spoiler warning. So they're mentioned briefly in Harry Potter, these ancient Egyptian wizards, but you also see right from the beginning some really interesting little links to, not exactly history, but it's all to do with names. Names in Harry Potter are really, really, really interesting. This is one of my little spoilers, half spoilers really, because it's about the fact that sometimes by name of an individual, a character, you get an idea of whether they're good or bad. For example, pretty much the first characters that you meet in the first book, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, are Albus Dumbledore and Rubeus Hagrid. Now, Dumbledore is a lovely word. It's an old English word for bumblebee. Albus means white. Hagrid, put that to one side, but his first name, Rubeus, means red. So you have white and red right from the beginning. It's really, really interesting. And who else? Well, who's Harry's greatest enemy? I suppose there's a few. Voldemort is one. Mort, of course, we think of death anyway. Also Malfoy, Draco Malfoy. Mal means bad. So you can tell straight away if you're good or bad. Now the Malfoys are very interesting because anybody in that family, they all seem to have links to star constellations. For example, you have Andromeda. Draco is also a constellation in the sky. And a Malfoy cousin is also the brightest star in the night sky. It's about 50.62 million miles from Earth. It's also known as the dog star. It's Sirius. And within ancient civilizations, the dog star had enormous importance. Going back to those ancient Egyptians, you might be able to tell I'm quite interested in ancient Egypt. Tenders, they used Sirius to calculate their calendars. On the first day of summer, Sirius rises just before the sun, and this became their New Year's Day. And it was used to predict when the life-giving river Nile would flood. And it's interesting that we now sometimes refer to those sort of long, hot, sultry summer days as dog days. Maybe because of Sirius Black. Before we move on, what about the name Harry Potter? I mean, my goodness me, there's not a lot there, is there? It's very ordinary, and maybe that's the point. That beneath this sort of ordinary exterior, here is a figure that is going to make enormous waves in his world. You don't have to have a fancy name to be able to do amazing things. Maybe that's the point, I don't know. So, in the Harry Potter stories, are there any real life wizards? I say real life, you know what I mean. People that exist in outside of the Harry Potter universe. Well, there are a few. Most are fictional, but there are a few. For example, Dumbledore is Order of Merlin, first class, and Dumbledore's pretty much Merlin, and he's got the long white beard and the hat and all those things, all those ideas of a typical wizard that we have. Dumbledore shares with Merlin. And there are some others as well. So on the Chocolate Frogs, you have Circe, features in the Odyssey, so an ancient Greek poem written by Homer. Ptolemy, ancient Egyptian, but actually Greek. And there's another figure who plays a key role in the first story, Nicholas Flamel. He was a real-life alchemist, poet, astrologer, and philosopher. He was born in Paris about 1330, and one night he claimed to be visited in a dream by an angel who told him about a special book. The next day he saw it at a cheap bookstall. Unfortunately, it was in the language that he didn't understand, that of Hebrew, but it was a manual for turning common metal into gold. Unfortunately, it also needed a special ingredient, and you've probably guessed what it is: the Philosopher's Stone. It's all there. Anyway, eventually he is able to find this stone and is able to turn base metal into stone. If you go to Paris, you can still visit his home today. It's now a restaurant, so you could have a meal and check out his home. Before we move on, it's worth exploring the sacredness of stones and their use in rituals in the past, because here in Southampton's collection we have some beautiful ancient stone axes. They've been polished to the finest sheen. They look as if they were made yesterday. They're of a stone called jade, which doesn't naturally occur here in Britain. And actually the jade axes we have came from Italy. And there's a suggestion that this type of stone, very difficult to get hold of, you have to climb up a mountain to get it, that people at the time believed that they had some sort of sacred, spiritual, magical power. That just having it was special. Maybe the person who owned it was a magician of their time. We don't know that, but they're lovely things, and you see important sacred stones throughout history. They're brilliant. So, what's the most famous spell in Harry Potter? You might say Expelliarmus, used quite a lot. Wingardium Leviosa, allows things to hover a little bit. Or possibly it's Avada Kedavra, the killing curse. Spells and words are incredibly important. It says in the fourth book, Mad-Eye Moody says, look, you can say the death curse to me and it probably won't do any good to me. You have to say it right, you have to say it in the right mind frame. And we find spells like this hidden throughout the past. Now, I did history at the University of Southampton, and when I did so, I did a module which, I've got to be honest, I never thought I'd use again. And it was on magic bowls in ancient Jewish literature. So this is maybe 2,000 or so years old. And what people used to do at this time, over in where Israel is now, they would get bowls, and they would write spells in a language called Aramaic, which they wrote on the outside, and then they wrote them all into the inside. And these might be spells for all sorts of things, for health, for wealth, for love, for all sorts of things. And the idea is you would get this bowl with a spell, and you would place it upside down, and you'd bury it with a hope of your wish, your prayer coming true, your spell, for want of a better word. And the idea was that these would capture demons and spirits. That's why they're that way around. There's another spell in Aramaic that you will have heard of, which sounds incredibly similar to Avada Kedavra. It is, of course, abracadabra. It's an Aramaic word, and the word means to disappear. And it's an ancient spell. In fact, we find it in Roman times, so a Roman doctor living about 1,800 years ago, he gives a cure for a fever. And what he says is, you need to write the word abracadabra, and then you need to write it again, but take off one of the letters, the one at the end, and then you write it again and you take off one more letter, so it kind of gets smaller and smaller. You write that, and then you tie it around the patient's neck for 9 days, and then you toss it into a river or a stream running to the east, and then when the water dissolved, the words, the fever would disappear. How long do fevers last? Well, they either kill you, in which case the spell's not any good, or you get better. But abracadabra, a real spell. I could carry on about this subject for a long, long time, but I'm not going to. I am going to stop there. But honestly, the stories within the story get to the heart of so much of what it is to be people. And that's why I love them so much. If you did enjoy this talk, please do subscribe, do comment as well. It's lovely to find out who's watching, ask questions, and do share this talk as well. But thanks so much for watching.